Good afternoon. I am Kelly Brown Douglas, Dean of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary here in New York City. Thank you all for joining us for another in our series of Just Conversations, where we engage issues of racialized inequities intrinsic to our nation and our collective responsibility to create a more just future. Today's Just Conversation is another in a series of conversations with members of a cohort of 12 scholars, faith leaders, artists, and activists who have come together in a project sponsored by a Henry Luce Foundation grant to reflect on religion and racial justice, expanding the immoral imaginary through film, and to share their research and work with one another. It is my deep pleasure to have joining me today two of my colleagues here at Union Seminary, Dr. Rima Vesely-Flad, visiting professor of Buddhism and Black Studies at Union Theological Seminary, and Dr. John Thatamanil, professor of Theology and World Religions, also here at Union. Professors Vesely-Flad and Thatamanil, thank you both so much for joining me today in this conversation. So I want to jump right in with an issue that is becoming more pressing in this country: white Christian nationalism. While white Christian nationalism is certainly not a new phenomenon in this nation, there are certain times when it explodes, if you will, onto the sort of religio-political public square with vigor. Typically times when white Christians feel that they are under attack by non-white Christians. And so perhaps it's no accident that at a time in this nation where there is a racial, ethnic, demographic shift, thus a decline in the white demographic, while there's an increase in racial, ethnic groups, white Christian nationalism has indeed exploded once again with violent intensity. So can I ask you both to speak to what you find most challenging, if not dangerous, with this explosion of white Christian nationalism that we're now facing, and what impact this has had on the work that you do? Jump right in. They are never quiet.
It's a huge question. John, does something come to mind immediately?
Well, I think for me, there's such a profound contradiction between the two terms, white and Christian, that already arrests my attention. That, you know, how to help folks understand that the Christian is the kind of category that ought, at least in theological and religious imagination, be something that contests the other term, so that the marriage isn't so smooth and so easy, so it doesn't come so trippingly off the tongue, right? The Christian is at least in principle supposed to be about some kind of commonwealth, some kind of beloved community that resists parochialism. So there's a grief I feel when I hear the words bound together. So that's my first reaction, right? How do we contest the way in which the word Christian begins to function in virtually the same way that the word white does, as a kind of identity marker that creates in its orbit a kind of us versus them impulse, when ideally, speaking as a theologian, the hope is that the term would be recognized as a kind of pressure against all provincialisms, a desire for love.
Yeah, I want to get to this in a minute. I want to hear from Professor Vesely-Flad, but I do want to get to this, you know, how this becomes, whiteness and Christianity become these identity markers that are almost synonymous. But Professor Vesely-Flad.
Yeah, so much comes to mind in that conversation, so I'm glad we'll return. But the immediacy that you, I think, are pointing to, Dean Douglas, is that we have this attack against what's called critical race theory, which is such a misnomer. I think it really is, worlds apart. It's a label that signifies everything but what it actually is. And then, of course, the attacks on especially non-binary and transgender children and families, LGBTQIA plus individuals and communities. I mean, when I think of the kind of virulence that I think that term white Christian nationalism is pointing to, and how it's being encoded and how violent that word is, I think, a very poignant word, in that it is a real assault on individuals and families, on what we are confronted with in the classroom or not, what is being erased from the classroom. The fact that somebody like myself, a Black woman, biracial, bisexual, is being erased from curricula, the fact that certain voices that have been so formative for me personally are no longer sanctioned or celebrated, that is a very big deal. And what it takes me back to actually are the words of, or the analysis of Frederick Douglass, who looked at anti-immigrant legislation and saw a kind of narrowness. And the way that Frederick Douglass pointed to it was to say there is this conflation of whiteness and Christianity, so that in this case, he was pointing to the exclusion of the Chinese who were associated with Buddhism, who were coming over. And he said, let's expand, let's not contract. But it does seem as though our country, or certain aspects of our country that are quite loud and getting tremendous traction, are asking or even forcing our country to contract in certain sectors. And it's very frightening.
Yeah. Now, I want to thank you. I want to stay with this for a moment, and how you have readily pointed to this connection between sort of the white Christian nationalism, and this is the way it becomes this identity marker of what it means to be an American, and then it begins to exclude on basis of ethnicity, race, gender identities, and sexual expressions. But people don't seem to understand the relationship between this sort of explosion, reemergence, and such with violent intensity of white Christian nationalism, and the attacks on critical race theory and what's going on in our schools. I just read a story today where a curriculum was put forward that talks about Rosa Parks and doesn't mention race.
Yes, I saw that too. Right. Too.
So yeah. What's the relationship here between white Christian nationalism and this attack on, if you will, CRT and all that implies?
It seems to me that so much of this material operates at a deeper level than we get to. What I mean by that is that it all seems like very sophisticated affect engineering. I mean, if we sort of go at the issue at a conceptual level and try to explain, well, the critical race theory is not what we think it is, it misses the fact that what's being produced, or at least the attempt to produce in the national life, is a sentiment or a series of sentiments like fear, of threat, of anger. And by producing these powerful sentiments, mobilizing certain kinds of constricted group identities, and us versus them sentiments. And what it feels to me like is that we're getting outplayed. That is to say, those who want to resist these kinds of enclosures, we fail to realize that what people are doing is very sophisticated affect engineering. And I wish we would find a way to sort of appreciate that, and not think that a better argument will alone do the trick. Now, we're academics, we're going to make the arguments, but underneath and motivating a lot of this is a skill that knows that if you get people where they live and turn their emotional energies in certain directions, you have them.
Well, that can only happen, and it's not one of the sort of biggest challenges, if you will, to an aspiring democracy and a more inclusive kind of nation is inequality and injustice that allows one to play upon these fears of others and allows people to scapegoat, et cetera. So my question becomes then, how do we change this narrative, and what is our role and what is the role of religious institutions, religious leaders in changing this narrative? And Professor Vesely-Flad rightly points to the fact that, again, this isn't a new narrative. You know, Frederick Douglass spoke of it, but we also know during the surge of immigrants coming in from Southern Europe and at the turn of the century, there was this ideal that if you evangelize, you can Americanize them, right? Meaning if you Christianize them, you can Americanize them. They can become great patriots. So this has been a prevailing narrative. How do we begin to change it? And more particularly, what is the role of religious institutions and leaders, especially Christian institutions and leaders, since, you know, this is going on under the name of Christianity?
Well, I'll just jump in briefly and conjure up yet another one of my let's just say angels sitting on my shoulder, and that is James Baldwin.
Oh, yes.
Who in The Fire Next Time, I think, offered us so much. That short essay gave us this enormous window into the kind of emotional affect, John, that you are pointing to, and also our capacity to confront it all, as you are pointing to, Dean Douglas. So one thing that Baldwin talks about is that Black people have functioned as a fixed star. Now, of course, he's operating in a binary, a black-white binary, but he says for this star to move means something gets threatened. And I think something is being threatened, right? That's some of the emotional affect that is arising. But Baldwin was always compassionate and always hopeful. And what he argues for, and this points to your question, Dean Douglas, he argues for being able to move through suffering. He says white people have managed to deny, repress, avoid, project their suffering, including a fear of death. But how do we confront it and how do we move through it? So rather than avoiding the conversation about historical slavery and its manifestations today, how do we actually take on the horror of it and develop emotional capacity? And the phrase that came to mind as you were speaking, John, about emotional affect was emotional fragility, or what gets termed sometimes white fragility. So my question is, how do we develop a kind of stamina? Baldwin called it unshakable inner authority. How do we develop a kind of resilience? That's what I do think religion, or we'll say religious traditions, religious practices, belief systems have to offer us, is I think these systems have a way of responding to the fears we feel, which are real, not to, repress the anxieties that are arising, but to actually be able to turn towards them and develop some capacity, some emotional resilience, and some capacity to ask what's being threatened at this moment and deal with that rather than trying to change that which is threatening.
So it sounds to me like you are, and John, jump right in a minute, but I just want to pick up on this real quick. Sounds to me like implied in that when you say that religion and religions have the capacity to sort of respond to that, implied is what we aren't doing, right? So what are religious institutions, religious leaders not doing, and how do we translate what both you and Professor Thatamanil are saying? How do we translate that into action on the public square? What aren't we doing? What ought we to be doing?
Well, I so loved and resonate deeply with what Rima was just saying. The word that I kept hearing in my ear as she was speaking is discernment. And also the building of emotional capacity. Both of those two terms seem to me core work that religious traditions try to do at their best. I wonder if there aren't at least two things that are misfiring in American religious life. At least on the Christian scene, there is a kind of sense of peril, of loss of cultural prestige, because the situation that held in last mid-century, where mainline Christian institutions had a kind of cultural heft and authority, and people who taught at Union were to be found on the cover of Time magazine, right? I think there's a feeling of a loss of that kind of stature that leads to a kind of sense of threat and being imperiled, which leads to, I think, a kind of closing in on ourselves. Oh, what went wrong? What are we doing? Rather than having the kind of religious, spiritual, and theological confidence to deal with the kinds of issues we're talking about now, and letting the status of the institution be something like a background concern rather than a foreground concern, right? So that's, I think, one key issue. But I think the other fundamental issue, and I'm sorry to keep going on about this, is that perhaps our traditions have become so belief-focused, so doctrine-focused, that we have lost a capacity to attend to practice. And one of the things I get from hanging out with, like wonderful Buddhists like Rima, is that they are reminding, creedally obsessed Christians, maybe religious life lives closer to practice, closer to contemplation. And then perhaps real transformation comes when we learn to do different things with our hearts, with our bodies, and not just with the brain. So, interreligious wisdom is in part a way of sort of being tutored by neighbors of other traditions in things that perhaps we are neglecting within our own household, and being brought to wisdom that way.
So I want to pick up on, because our time, my goodness, we could go on forever, and I want to get to this. So you've given me a transition point. You talk about interreligious wisdom, right? Clearly, we are at a time when we can say that this nation is more interfaith, more interreligious than perhaps it has ever been. Yet that is also meant that is under attack. That has created even this upsurge of white Christian nationalist violence. The white Christian nationalism itself is violent, and then there's the overt violence that goes along with that violent ideology. How do we move? So we always are having these interfaith, interreligious dialogues, right? It's sort of like having diversity training. How do we move from the interreligious, interfaith dialogue to being an interfaith, interreligiously just society? And what would that look like?
Well, that's the enormous question I heard you starting with. And certainly we can point to respect, but I want to echo what John was just saying about practice. And in this mode of contemplation, so, in different iterations of Buddhism, there's much about working with the concept of impermanence, returning to the body, working with the breath. There are many different practices and rituals and what have you, but they are embodied rituals. And what I want to propose, and this actually comes out of my MDiv training at Union more than 20 years ago now, is that turning towards the body and working with an idea, a concept of impermanence of that which is around us, can be brought into the Christian tradition and actually what I wrote my MDiv thesis on was Holy Week liturgy, and we're about to go into Holy Week.
Right.
And what I loved about Holy Week liturgy, even as a practicing Buddhist, is that it's very embodied, and we're brought into all of these different identities, but not just in a kind of psychological or rational way, but actually in a deeply emotional way. So, if we think about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane and how we assume this kind of witnessing of a life about to be taken and a kind of terror of that. And then we enter into Maundy Thursday and the washing of the feet and how embodied that is. And then we enter into Good Friday. And again, this kind of witnessing, but we become the executioners. And then we enter into Holy Saturday and work through the different origins of our identities as Christians. And then we have the resurrection. So I say this because I think coming up in just a week and a half, just about 2 weeks, we have this opportunity to be deeply embodied within Christian practice. And I think really confront something in a deeply emotional way if we give ourselves the permission and the space to do so. If we can concentrate on what's happening in the body, that's where, for me personally, that is where multi-religious or interfaith practices intersect, and where we can meet each other, but perhaps not trying to change or even influence each other as much as coming back to ourselves, to the point where we turn towards whatever is going on in ourselves. And once we have some inner stability, once we have done that deeper emotional work, we are much more capable of meeting what we might have been told is the quote unquote other. So that is some possibility, and hopefully that will ripple outward into what becomes then a more just society.
Kelly, can I just step in and just point out that, right, what just happened here, right?
Exactly.
We just got an eloquent reading of Christian Holy Week from a Buddhist. Right after me, a Christian priest commended the virtues of contemplative attention. And that's what I think both of us are interested in, this kind of giving of gifts to each other and recognizing the beauty of each other's traditions, so we can combine our resources to deal with these, structural issues. And let's be also, just so we name it, for all the ways in which we sort of are talking about Christian nationalism and the way that identity and threat and emotion work, there are real material issues too, right? There is a profound and growing inequity between city and country. This is a global phenomena, right? If people in rural parts of our various nations actually no longer have any meaningful work to do, or any even prospective work that to sustain their families, they're going to be a lot more vulnerable to being hijacked by skillful affect engineers. So to ignore the material conditions that are behind all of this would be supremely naive of us. And I'm sad to say that, those of us who are affiliated with the left, with the Democratic Party anyway, are not talking about class at all. So we have to figure out how to talk about race and class and religious diversity in complex interweaving.
Well, because it's intersecting realities, but what you're precisely pointing to is, again, we're going to continue to have these conversations and upsurges of nationalist, populist kind of realities until we deal with the inequities and inequalities that give them birth. And so I'm going to end on a question, but affirm this dialogue and what you pointed out becomes a model. It seems to me it's the way we began to move forward with what just happened between you and Professor Vesely-Flad, John. So let me end with this question, because we are certainly over, but we are a part of a cohort. We've come together in a cohort looking at the way in which film plays a role in not only shaping our perhaps identities, our way of seeing the world, if not our way of seeing ourselves, but of others. And perhaps we have come together and through this cohort, hopefully by looking at various films, grown in our awareness about the role and power of film, even if we have grown in our awareness about one another. So I want to end this conversation by asking you that as we've been through this year of discussion on film with our cohort, how do you see the role of film even in this matter of interfaith, interreligious justice, the role of film, period, in moving toward a more equitable and just society? And so it's almost open space. What have you learned and what's the role of film?
Rima, you want to go first this time?
I've learned that we have very, very smart cohort members.
I know. I would never look at a film the same way again, right?
Yes. Well, it is not lost on me that images and narrative are profoundly, profoundly influential, and that the prospect and the experience of digesting, let's say, realities that we don't easily or readily come into contact with is profoundly moving. And it has taken some real work to create the space to watch the films and then the time to discuss. But in so doing, I have just found myself thinking more deeply, analyzing more deeply. And so it is one way of introducing and connecting. I mean, I think there's such exposure that's happened. But going back to all of our conversation about emotional capacity, I feel like in my own experience that has deepened.
Thank you.
And I can't help but think about, we just got through the Oscars, and one of the movies we watched, cleaned up Everything Everywhere All at Once. I mean, I get the words mixed up, but you know what I mean. Right. That was just a fabulous film because, among other things, we just saw bodies that are typically not depicted in mainstream cinema. That matters, right? The sheer visibility or invisibility of populations. And then at the Oscar show, there was the sort of dance number from RRR where, South Asian bodies and music were center stage, the big stage, right? And for me to see folks who look like me dancing, and the music that's part of my psyche, finding expression, that's powerful. And I think there's a bit of the kingdom breaking in when diversity emerges, right? When homogeneity falls away, and the public space begins to look like what the national body really is like, right? And insofar as film has that capacity to depict diversity and show us to ourselves as richer than certain imaginations would like to depict who we are, something breaks through.
I think that's a good way to end. Show us to ourselves. And if we see ourselves, perhaps that will expand our moral imaginary of who we can be. Thank you so very much, Professor John Thatamanil and Professor Rima Vesely-Flad, for this really rich conversation. And I say to all of you there listening, again, this is the kind of conversation that we have been able to have in response to film. So I invite you back for another of our Just Conversations, and I thank you for joining us in this one.